felt one time, then I fell again. I fell a third time, can't get away from the sin. I keep falling, then I come back to you, crawling, asking forgive me now I'm ballin', knowing that I let you down, appalling. I don't wanna jeopardize my calling. When I hear your voice no more I'm halting. I just wanna live in the world you're revolving. I am so imperfect I'm getting involved in these flesh-tied friends, the blind consulting, pulling me away from the world and revolting. Asking for forgiveness is probably insulting, but you keep taking me back and you're vaulting. Give me chances. You keep giving me chances. You give me chances. You just keep giving me chances. King. Royalty, stand up, brand up, fam up, hand out, no way, hands up, know what, name that, it's mine, claim that, it's time, message, we shine, above all, the decline, the darkness cannot last, the shadow of my past, before I gain knowledge of heritage, I have the bloodline that I share, most powerful out here, the mover of mountains is who I am touting, the richest among us is who I'm the son of, from sundown to sun up, that's how I the come up, position is just mine, the favor in due time, can't have it, man you lying, the powerless you trying, enemy beneath me, there's nothing to teach me, the people receive me, cause my God complete me, and my God does keep me, and my God they free me, and my God redeem me, and my God relieve me, I'm king in the million, crown me, I am winning my position, God's giving, God's in it, God's surely king. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to the Elevation Podcast. My name is Shawn, Riff-Raff. I am here, as I am every Tuesday, to have cool conversations with cool people around the globe, different corners of the world. And the point, as I always tell you every week, the point is to bring people together to see what it is that makes what we have in common that makes us all, the common human race. And that is my goal, to spread positivity and bring value to people and, shed a little light, little inspiration. That's what we do here. Today, I have a very unique and special guest, one unlike any other guest that I've had before. And I think, of course, we have authors and musicians and artists and all of that stuff. And she is an author, and her story is very, very unique. And I don't want to give it away, so I'm not going to talk too much more. Her name is Elizabeth Meyers. Thank you so much for coming on, Elizabeth. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. It's good to be on your show today. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. I think you are, interestingly enough, as I was looking through your stuff and I was reading, and you were talking about how much you move around.
Yep.
And I remember when we first connected several months ago to get you on the show and schedule you on the show. You were like, "Oh wait, got to reschedule because I'm moving," so we had to push it back several months. And so as I'm reading through your stuff, I'm like, "Well, this is not an exaggeration." I want to get into that, but before we do that, I want to. I always like to know about people, have a context to begin a conversation, and just learn about a little bit about you, your life, the short version of your life story. What brings about you, and tell us a little about yourself so we can kick it off.
Yeah, sure. So my husband and I have been married for 25 years. We just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. We met in college. We both went to the Air Force Academy, but we didn't actually start dating until our first assignment we had together in San Antonio. So we have 8 kids, so there's always an adventure going on in our house. And like you said, we've moved around a lot. My husband is just recently retired from 31 years of active duty Air Force service. He's been a fighter pilot, so we've had a busy, crazy, wonderful life, and we've just relocated now back to Texas, which is where I'm originally from,
Okay.
and super excited to be here and ready to start the next adventure of our lives. And I'm now have the time. Our children are older, and my husband's job has changed, so now there's more time and space for me to focus on my writing and speaking and these kinds of things. And so I'm very excited about what God has on the horizon for the next phase of our adventure in life. But basically, I summarize my life by telling people that we move a lot, we eat a lot, we make a lot of messes and a lot of noise, and we have a lot of fun. That kind of sums us up. There's always something going on here. And now we've added farm animals to the mix. We just got
Oh,
chickens
wow.
and ducks and sheep and a dog to guard them all. So that just adds to the happy chaos of our home.
Wow. Having 8 children. So let me ask you a very typical question. Well, not typical for me, but I'm sure it's typical.
I usually get the same 10 questions over and over.
It's probably I know it's one of them actually. Are all of did you bring kids too? Like, is it a mixed
Yeah.
family, or is it all like you and your husband,
Yep.
biological kids?
Just the two of us, no twins. I had, well, a total of 9 pregnancies. That's part of my story I'm going to get into later, but 8, children from that. There's no adoptions. They're all just ours, one at a time. And we didn't set out to do that from the beginning. We didn't get married and go, we want to have a big family. We're not from big families. I have one sister. My husband has one brother. So we were kind of going into uncharted territory, and it was really just a gradual decision, just kind of, with each kid, God changed our heart a little more. And it was just so fun. We enjoyed them so much. And it's like, how can we stop being a part of this miracle of life? I was very blessed that I had relatively easy pregnancies. So, if I had, I know some women who have really struggled, and if I had been on that end, it would have been really hard to continue going. But I was blessed in that I always felt better during pregnancy than I did. Part of my story is I struggled with depression, and I'll get into that later. But
Sure.
When I was pregnant, I wasn't depressed. So we kept having babies.
What are the age ranges? So like, are you did you have them all?
They're all
That's
roughly
funny.
about 2 years apart, give or take
Okay.
a little. There's a bigger gap in there where my husband was deployed after 9/11, and there's a bigger gap where we lost one of our children. And there's the last 2 were only 15 months apart. I'd always wanted to have twins. And after I had those 2 15 months apart, I'm like, you know what? That counts. That's
Close enough. Close enough. We can dress them the same.
Yeah. So
What's life
our
like?
youngest right now is 9. He's going to be going into 4th grade. I can't believe that. I'm like, my baby is going into 4th grade. Our oldest is 23. He's in the Marine Corps, and he's married to a lovely lady. Her name is also Elizabeth.
Oh wow.
And then our next oldest daughter has left the home. She's graduated and is working in the ministry. So we have, I say we only have 6 at home right now. People are like, only? I'm like, yeah, it does feel a little bit empty, but we have this huge oak dining table that a friend made for us so that we can all sit down and eat together.
Right.
But when the kids are gone, if they're out doing various activities, it's just my husband and I. We're like at opposite ends of this huge table. I'm like, I feel like Beauty and the Beast. I don't know which one of us is the Beast, but we're at this huge table, at opposite ends. I'm like, when all the kids are grown and gone, we need a smaller table, or this is going to feel weird.
Do you have so are your families like, do you have things where your extended family comes together, like, do you have like events and stuff like where you go to and your extended family comes
Not
together?
specifically, being in the military, we've moved around a lot. So some places we're closer to family than others. And, so we're really close to both of our families. And so we had, different times when we would visit or they would visit. My husband's parents have lived overseas as missionaries. So the interesting thing is now we've moved back to Texas, which is where my family's from. So they're
Right.
just over an hour away. And we have some acreage, so there's like a little guest cabin for them on our land. And then his parents just last week have come off the mission field to do more of their ministry work online, and so they're actually going to be building a place at the other corner of our property. So we've gone from kind of being independent and spread out and sort of all over the world to now we're in the same acreage. So yeah, it's fun. We're looking forward to it, and it's neat that my children can have all their grandparents. They're all still alive. They're all still healthy, and that everybody's going to be great.
What you know? What was marriage? You know, having a big family like that. How do you find time in marriage to really do marriage?
Hmm.
Because that seems like a lot.
Yeah, that's a great question. And early on, when they were all younger, it was hard.
Yeah.
I got it to the point where I take 6 kids to the grocery store by myself before I had one old enough to stay home with the others. But when our
Uh,
oldest child turned 12, it was like freedom. We've grown our own built-in babysitter. And he was amazing as a babysitter, super responsible. He was like Eagle Scout. Now he's a Marine officer. And then our daughter,
wow.
the second oldest, was the fun one, that would do cool things with the kids and entertain them. So together they made this awesome babysitting pair. And so it's
Had
really
to
been
wait
since
12 years to get it, but yeah.
yeah, since then, my husband was getting ready to go on a deployment for 6 months, and so we started the habit of going out on a date once a week.
Hmm.
And then we were like, well, why do this just because you're deploying? We should do this all the time. So
Right.
when he came back home, we continued that. And so we still do that now. We have date night once a week where
Yeah.
we like Mexican food. That's our jam. So we go get Mexican food and, either come home and watch a Netflix movie or like tonight is date night. We've got to go to Lowe's and get some stuff for a home project. So, just
Right.
whatever, but it gives us time just to talk without interruption from a bunch of little munchkins running around.
So, your husband being deployed like that, how often over the last 25 years was your husband not, like
Hmm.
you mentioned 9/11, so I guess he was gone off to Iraq. Um,
Yeah. Well,
well,
actually,
did you
then he
say
went
Iraq? Maybe you
to
said Afghanistan.
Korea. But yeah, so he
Korea.
had 2 deployments early on, and they were shorter back in that day. It was 2 or 3 months. And
Right.
then more recent times they've gone to 6 months. They're just on a constant rotation of, and there's a limited number of squadrons of his aircraft, so they just keep getting tagged over and over and over.
Right.
So he went on a 6 month deployment as a squadron commander of the fighter unit he was a part of, and then most recently he did a half of a one as a commander of like a leader over several squadrons. So that was just 3 months. But that's been part of the excitement of retiring, and the part where we're in life now is like you never have to leave.
No more
Yeah, you can stay here.
deployments.
Yeah.
Well, so tell me a little bit about how you got into writing. Tell me about your book that you put out. When
Mhm.
did it come out?
It was originally published in 2017.
Okay.
Um,
Um,
and it started really just as my own journal is how it began. I've always loved reading and writing. And, even as a kid, I loved writing. And, I thought, oh, someday I might write a book, but I had no idea what it would be about.
right.
Um, and it really took a long time in my life until I had an experience worth writing about.
Right.
Um, but I have always enjoyed writing. So that's always been a part of my life in other ways.
Right. So your first book came out in 2017.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned that you had a child that passed away. Could you
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it was my 6th pregnancy, and I actually have really wrestled with being pregnant. We were the the due date aligned with our next move, and it felt overwhelming to me. We already had 5 young children, to have a baby and move at the same time within a month. And so that was really the only pregnancy where I just really struggled early on embracing it. I felt resentful a little bit, and it took me a couple months to work through that, and that's a whole another story. But I finally got to the point where I embraced it. I was excited about being pregnant. I was looking forward to this child, and I was just really happy for a short period of time. And then we lost him in the second trimester. We were on vacation. I was at my parents' house, and he was just kind of unexpectedly stillborn at home. We didn't have any clue that anything was wrong. So it was very traumatic. I mean, it's traumatic anyway that you lose a child, but just the
Right.
way things happened and the unexpectedness, and being at home, and his body was just born, and it was clear that his spirit was already with Jesus. And then, I didn't have any bleeding or any problems until after all of that. So, I just really had a rough time dealing with that. Unfortunately, in our culture, we don't really have a great way to honor the life of a child that died before they were born.
Right.
And I
Wow.
faced a lot of insensitivity from some of the medical people that took me a long time to work through that and to forgive
Right.
people, to realize, they didn't realize how hurtful what they were saying to me was.
Right.
But I got stuck in a place of grief that I couldn't get out of, and depression. And, people kind of look at me and go, what's wrong? Move on, just get pregnant again. So I felt like there was something wrong with me
Right.
why can't I move on? And, as a Christian, there was this double guilt of I'm supposed to be joyful and peaceful, and I'm depressed and anxious, and I can't stop, and I can't pray it away. And,
Right.
so I just went through this whole period of, feeling like God was mad at me, feeling like he didn't care. It's like, what did I do wrong? And, so I really just doubted and questioned everything I thought that I believed. And that went on for several years. And eventually on the outside, I wound up just kind of on the outside, I pretended like things were fine. I learned kind of early on that people don't really like to talk about dead babies. They didn't really know how to respond to my grief. If I mentioned Timothy, my son, at all, people just kind of go, oh, and then they'd leave. So, so I just hid everything, and I, put the smile on the outside and tried to act like everything was good and went through the motions. But it wasn't. It was just, I was crushing inside, and you just can't sweep things like that under the rug. Eventually, you've got to face it. You've got to deal with it. You got to drag it out into the light. And so I got to the point where the pain of staying the same was greater than the pain of changing. And I said to my husband, I'm like, something is wrong with me and I need to get help. And he's like, okay, let's do what we need to do to help you to get you feeling better. And I couldn't identify like what's the root cause. I had tried all these different things. I tried supplements. I tried praying it away. I tried these different things. And I'm like, am I exhausted because I'm depressed, or am I depressed because I'm so tired that I'm unmotivated? Do I have a physical problem or a mental problem, or is it spiritual? Is it just that God's angry at me and I've been angry at him, and that's why all this problem is happening? And if I just get myself right spiritually, then it will all vanish. So I just decided to attack everything on all four fronts. This is my military background speaking. Physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. I just took whatever next baby step that I could to improve in that area. There was nothing dramatic, but over time I gradually healed, and God walked me through that. And of course, the first step in all of those areas was just admitting that I had a problem that was too big for me, and going to someone else. I started with my husband, but I also went to my pastor and his wife. I went to my doctor. I got on medication. I went to Christian counseling, and I worked through these issues that I hadn't been able to express or communicate.
True.
And so I got help in a lot of different ways. I worked physically on myself. As a mom of 8 kids, self-care was non-existent. Like, who has time for self-care? I can't even go to the bathroom by myself. And but I learned that self-care is not selfish, that in order to be the mom God's called me to be, I need to take care of myself first sometimes, and that's okay. So, it was just this whole process. And like I said earlier, it was from my quiet times in the morning. I was journaling. And by the time I got 3/4 of the way through the first notebook, I'm like, I think this might be a book. And so I'm like, I'm going to write a book, not realizing how big an undertaking that was. So it took me 3 years to get that book written. But that's the book, Undefeated from Trial to Triumph. And it kind of starts to outline some of the things I learned. And then my second book is coming out later this year. That's the first one there. My second one kind of goes through more of those baby steps in each of those areas of what I've learned. And I just really want to help other people who might be, in that dark place, struggling and not knowing what to do like I was. And so I'm not a mental health expert or nutritionist or, any kind of expert of anything other than I'm a fellow sufferer who's been in the trenches. And I feel like God's given me some things to share.
I think I think you have a really powerful story. I think I tend to disagree with you that you're not an expert in anything because apparently you're an expert in running a household.
Okay, maybe that. I'm an expert diaper changer.
But I think that you have a very powerful story there. So I think one thing you said that is a tweet for sure is self-care is not selfish. And one of the things that I found that you said, but that's very true, is that you gotta kind of do a whole bunch of different things instead of just relying on the one thing. And I think prayer is great, and prayer should be a part of what you're doing, and prayer should be a part of your spiritual walk, but also going to get professional help. Should be a part of, because so you said four things. You said your prayer life and your exercise and healthy life, and counseling, Christian counseling, and going to see a doctor. I think that that is a different way of approaching things, but I think that's a very balanced, well-rounded way. What would you say from your experiences? What would you say? What was the first thing that you decided to do of all of the things? Like, what was the first thing that you was like, hey, I'm gonna do this first? Like, what when you was struggling with depression and stuff like that, what was the first thing that you did?
So I don't remember like the exact order. I felt like I was kind of starting on all things at once, but I know what I coach and encourage people to do now is to start with prayer. I feel like the spiritual kind of trumps the physical, mental, and emotional, although they're all integrated, they're all important, they all affect one another. And I feel like we miss that in a lot of times in Western Christianity. I feel like
Right.
Eastern philosophies and religions include the body and the physical in their ideas about how things work. But as Western Christians, we kind of just tend to leave that out and disregard
Sure.
the importance of our physical bodies.
Sure.
But it does have an impact on our spirit and our mind and our heart, our emotions and everything. So I encourage people to work first on that relationship with God, that connection. I love in John 15 where Jesus tells his followers, if you stick tight with me, if you remain or abide in me, if you're with me, you can do anything. But apart from me, you can do nothing. And it's just like an apple tree limb that's fallen and it's on the ground. It's not going to bear fruit. It's not going to make an apple.
Right.
But if that same branch is connected to the trunk of the tree, it doesn't have to strive. It produces fruit because that's what it was created to do. And so I feel like that connection with God is primary. And in my case, I was very angry with God. I was very upset. I had this transactional view of God of, well, if I do all the things right and I avoid these other things that are wrong, then my life's going to just be all sunshine and roses. And that's not how the world works.
Not at all.
And so I really had to go to this deeper level of God is who he says he is. And God loves me no matter what's going on in my life. I really had to kind of flip the narrative around on its head in order to process through that. And I had to get to the place where I was okay with the fact that I didn't have answers to all my questions. I realized that if God came down and answered all the questions I had, I would still be left with the grief that I was carrying. And so I eventually got to the place where I'm like, I don't really actually want a God that I can understand. I want a God that I can trust even when I don't understand, because any God that I could understand wouldn't be worthy of my worship. He wouldn't be able to help me anyway. It'd be too small. I don't even understand myself. How do I think I can understand God? Right. And then I think, once we have that connection with God, then he can lead us through his Holy Spirit to the other little baby steps of, well, what's next? And especially when we're in a broken place, we can't think super long term. We can't necessarily see the light at the end of the tunnel even yet. We just have to go, what's the next step right in front of me, and take something small. And I go back to my time in basic training, was very intense, very, very long days. And when I woke up in the morning, they pound on my door, wake up. And my goal at that point in the morning was to make it to breakfast and survive. And then after breakfast, I'm like, okay, I did breakfast. Now I'm going to make it to lunch. I think the more intense the situation we're in, the smaller we have to break down our time block of what is reasonable for us to accomplish. Because if we think too far, it gets overwhelming. And I can relate. It's the same mindset in childbirth.
Sure.
I've had 8, 9-ish babies, and and then in the intense moments of that, it's like I need to survive the next 90 seconds. I can get through this contraction. I'm not going to think about how many hours I'm going to be like this. I'm just going to think about the next 90 seconds. And I think that mindset is very helpful when we're going through something really big and overwhelming and scary. We can't necessarily handle the whole thing all at once. We need to trust God to handle the whole thing all at once. And we need to just focus on what's the next best step right in front of me. What's the next baby step? Anything. It doesn't, when you're in a place of depression, maybe getting out of bed and maybe getting dressed is like a big goal. It just depends on where you are in life. And we need to celebrate all the small victories too.
You mentioned what I think was a really important point before when you were talking. You mentioned that you felt like the healthcare workers when you lost your baby, you felt like the healthcare workers were insensitive or unempathetic with you when you lost your child. What kind of feeling did they give you? I'm gonna lead to another question, but what kind of feeling when you said that? Like, what was it that made you feel that way?
So my son passed away before the 20-week mark, and after 20 weeks, they issue you a death certificate. They treat the child like a real person. But because he was before 20 weeks, they refused to refer to him as a baby. I mean, we went to the ER right away, and I had his body. He fit in the palm of my hand, very obviously human in every way. And they would only refer to him as the products of conception. And, as an there was no compassion of, oh, you've lost a child. It was, this is the product of conception. It's some sort of body tissue that's not important. And just in every way that they dealt with me and everything that they did with his body was a way of saying he's not important. He wasn't really human. I felt at the time like they were so concerned about honoring another woman's right to choose that they denied me of my right to grieve. That stripped that away from me. They wouldn't return his body to me. I wasn't able to bury him. They cremated his ashes and sprinkled it in a garden. And I was originally told that I would be able to come to that ceremony. And then later I called and they're like, oh, no, we already did that. That's already been done. And we don't invite parents to come because there's just too many religious views to take into account. We don't want to mess with it. So we just have, whatever doctors or nurses were involved, they show up for that baby. And I was like, well, I was out of town. I came into there were no doctors or nurses that knew me or my child. So the fact that, my son's ashes were scattered in this random garden and no one was there to represent him. And that just really grieved me in deep ways, just really wounded me that they were that disrespectful of me and just did not acknowledge that I had any loss at all. And the way they spoke to me, and then even afterward, I had to go for a follow-up checkup later, and the nurse comes in, she's like, all right, well, we should be able to hear baby's heartbeat now. And I was like, my baby's dead. There is no heartbeat. And she didn't say, oh, I'm sorry, or she just went, oh, and she left the room. I feel like people in that profession should have a little bit of a clue of how to deal with the death of a baby, because I'm not the only woman that this has happened to.
Sure.
I feel like they should have some coaching or some training on, how to compassionately deal with that. When they put you in the maternity section of the hospital where everybody else has their babies, and you're there, with nothing, but it was just really hard to deal with. And I had to work through the issue of forgiving them. And what really speaks to me there is, Jesus they're in the act of crucifying him. And he's saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And in that situation, my tendency is to go, oh, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew they were
Right.
condemning an innocent man, but he has such compassion for them. And in this case, nobody was out to hurt me. They weren't trying to, rub salt in my wounds. They just didn't know any better. They didn't
Yeah,
realize what they were doing. It was not intentional. And
right.
so, I had to work through that issue of forgiving them and doing just what Jesus did and saying, help me forgive them, Lord. They didn't know. It was just, it
Yeah,
was clumsiness. It was not malicious intent.
right. Um, well, that's definitely because you don't really think about that as yeah, we have all these religious and political and these arguments and viewpoints, and I think that sometimes we get so tied in our arguments or our opinions about something that we fail to consider the humanity in the scenario.
Yeah.
You know, your belief system becomes, you know, a justification of being inhuman to
Yeah.
others, or you're not wanting to deal with other people's belief systems. Or like in a hospital, you kind of gotta deal with it all.
Right.
And so, not wanting to deal with the conversation or the argument or the drama of it all, period,
Hmm.
leads you to being unempathetic that someone is really going through something
Right.
here. And, you maybe need to take a little bit, a little bit more care, a little bit more understanding of, what this person is, a little bit more empathy about what this person is going through.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of people struggle with the loss of an unborn child, and like you said, it's not really respected in the culture as an actual loss.
Hmm.
What advice would you have for a young lady or a young couple or whatever that is struggling with the loss of an unborn child, and everyone telling them,
Hmm.
get over it, whatever,
Hmm.
like, what advice would you have for somebody dealing with that particular scenario?
I would like to see us talk more about it openly. The statistics say that 25% of women have a miscarriage or lose a baby at some point, but we
Hmm.
never talk about it.
Yeah.
And when I went through that situation at that time, I had heard of like early miscarriages, where there wasn't really necessarily a body to deal with afterwards. Or I'd heard of, near the end, a stillbirth with a full term child. I didn't know it could happen right in the middle like that. I had crossed the threshold of the first 3 months where they're like, oh, this is shaky ground here, So I had this false sense of security that, oh, I'm in the zone where nothing bad happens. And I'd never even heard of any woman's story of losing a baby, at that time period in the pregnancy. But now that I've shared my story, I've had so many women come to me and go, me too, that also has happened.
Mm,
And I was like, why don't we talk about this more? Even just in,
right.
in, I've been a part of so many women's groups and, military spouse groups, women's Bible studies, all these things. And we never address it. We don't talk about it with
Right.
each other until
Right.
one of us says, hey, this happened, and then others will say me too. So I would just like to see us be more
Hmm.
open, even if it's just among us women to start with. But I think it's
Sure.
also important to include the men.
Right.
Husbands process the whole pregnancy thing differently.
Yeah,
um,
sure, they do.
and so my husband and I had a little bit of mismatch of, to me, I had lost a child just the same as if I'd lost any others. And when people say, well, at least he wasn't full term, that's to me like saying, oh, your 3-year-old child died, at least he wasn't 5 years old, because then you would have been more attached. And I'm like, no,
Right.
that's not how motherhood
It's not.
works. I'm
Yeah, it's
sorry.
not. It's really hot. That's
But
yes.
for men not being the ones carrying the child, it is a little different. And it just seems more real once the baby is actually there and they can hold the baby. The mom is holding the baby all the time. So it was a little harder for my husband to grasp what I was dealing with. He remarked at one point, he's sad, but it feels like hearing about the death of a stranger. It's like, oh yeah, that's a bummer, but it didn't grieve him the same way it grieved me. And part of my grief was, I'll never get to know this child. I didn't get to see, I have no happy memories of him laughing or playing, or, I have no
Right.
good pictures of him. Um, And so for me, that added to my grief. For my husband, it just kind of made it feel more detached.
Right.
So we had trouble understanding each other. And I think
Sure.
that's a huge thing, is to know that everybody grieves differently, and that's okay. And that's fine. Even among women, I've talked to some women who have lost a child in a similar situation, and it did not impact them emotionally as much as it did me. And that's okay. We all have different reactions to these things, and there's no one right way to respond. I think we just need to have grace with everybody of,
Yeah.
it's a hard thing and we don't necessarily know how to process it, and let's just have grace with each other as we walk through this journey together and say, your response is okay and my response is okay, and God can help us all.
Yeah. That's you have good teach. Uh, you know, I think, and when I think about men, we typically, in situations like that, it's the disappointment of the expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And with women, there was an actual connection
Mm-hmm.
that was severed. There's a physical connection, and so there's the completely different grieving process,
Mm-hmm.
because men may take it they take it a little bit more lightly,
Mm-hmm.
because what they lost, you know, wasn't a connection like that.
Right.
Was more like more so of an expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's easier for us to get over because that happens all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
for us, like expectations, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I expected to get the loan for the house, we didn't get it. It's a bummer. We move on,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, with a woman, it's completely different. It's a completely different connection. It's a
Mm-hmm.
completely different process. Like, you know, so I find that we have to deal with it different, and husbands who deal with it versus just talking about men. Husbands who deal with it, we have to find a way to support our wives
Mm-hmm.
in that. And I think you said something really, really super cool. We talk about a lot of things in these groups, women's groups and Bible studies, and for me, men's groups. And sometimes we don't take the time to talk about the things that really, really are important to affect in our lives, more so than we talk about the sort of principles and theoretical things or ideas of things that happen in the world. And it's like, man, we probably should talk a little bit more about things that affect, that
Yeah.
affect us really in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Man, this has been a really good conversation. I'm sitting up looking at my clock like, ooh, wait a minute. I want to ask you something that I ask everybody, which is completely unrelated to this whole conversation, but I ask everybody the same thing all the time, most of the time. If there was, and this would be a really good question for you, if there was one thing about the world that you could change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if God said, you know what, I'm gonna give you that, give you a little grace, and you had this moment like Jim Carrey and Morgan Freeman had on that movie, where you allowed to be God and change
Yeah.
one thing,
Yeah.
and change one thing, what would that be?
As soon as you start, I'm like, I know right away what it would be. I often have a prayer of, Lord, help me see people the way you see them.
Mm,
And if I could just snap my fingers and everybody could see each other the way God sees us,
mm,
that would change everything else. Just
yeah,
like you talked about earlier, we have a tendency to focus on our differences. We have so much more in common
yeah,
than where we differ.
yeah,
These human struggles and joys, they're common to all of us. No
yeah,
matter what country you're in, or what background you have, or how much money you have, or education. The love of a mother for her child, or the loss that we have with grief, or stress or anxiety that we may have over those are common to all of us. That
everybody.
I we and I think we just get so tied up in, oh, that person's different than me, or that person thinks something different than me, and that's just so not the point.
Yeah,
That is not the point. We are
yeah,
all in the same boat, and we're all sinking without Jesus, and
right.
none of us have any place to judge or point the finger at anybody else. God just sees us with love and with grace, and we are all messed up people. We are all broken, and He
Mm-hmm.
loves us all. And I think if we could just see each other through the eyes of grace and love that Jesus has for us, everything would be different.
Mm. Listen, first of all, that was a great answer. I think it was the first. That was, I mean, like everybody, some people say empathy, some people say, just a whole bunch of things. But seeing people the way God sees them, that's a first. Listen, I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been a very, very wonderful conversation. It's good to talk to you and good to hear from you and hear your story and hear your background. I hope people connect with you. I have your website there. Is that the best way to connect with you or
Yeah, that's kind of the hub, I have connections to everything there. On most social media things, I'm at the Liz Meyers. So you can look me up on Facebook or Instagram or, wherever you hang out social media wise. I also have a YouTube channel. And then my own podcast is called Resilient Life Hacks. I'm getting ready to launch season 2, but we just have a different guest on each week that's overcome something, and they share their story and then what they've learned, that listeners could apply to their lives as well. So I get to have a lot of great conversations with awesome people. So
awesome.
Yeah, those are the best ways to reach out.
Awesome. Listen, I thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you for sharing your story. It's been a really amazing time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been a delight to talk to you.
Thank you. This has been the Elevation Podcast. My name is Shawn Riff-Raff. We are here 7:30 every Tuesday. A new episode comes out. So thank you you guys keep connected. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here. We'll catch you next time. Peace out.
All right. Thanks. Bye.